Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 836, and today is September 11th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Before we get into the content of today's show, a word from our sponsor, and that is the Expat Money Summit 2025. This amazing annual online event is put together by the host of the Expat Money Show, that is Mikhail Thorup. He puts together a great lineup of speakers that will help you craft a plan B. If you ever decide that you and your family need to get out of the United States for whatever reason, to have another place to live abroad, to figure out where can you buy property, how to get that second passport, and importantly, what is the tax situation like if you were to move abroad. And so Mikhail and his guests at the Expat Money Summit will answer all these questions and more for you, and even better, they will do it for free. So if you just head on over to the expatmoneysummit.com, you could book your free ticket today. Now, he does offer extra events, a recording of it, and I will actually be one of the VIP panels this year. And so if you want a discount on your VIP ticket, use the promo code Kyle, Kyle, when you check out. I'm on a panel with Dave DeCamp, and so I'm sure it's going to be an excellent conversation that you will not want to miss. Now, before I get into the content on today's show, just want to remind people I do write a lot of articles, and so if you want to keep up with all my work, the easiest place to do that is over on my Twitter feed at @KyleAnzalone_. I post all the articles that I write, all the shows that I'm on, the news roundup that I put out daily. And so again, you could go to the Institute, you go to antiwar.com, you go to judgenap.com, you go to the YouTube channel and watch the Kyle Anzalone Show and Conflicts of Interest, or you could just head on over to my ads feed at KyleAnzalone_, where we are just shy of 10,000 followers, so help me hit that milestone. All right, let's get into the news today. First up here, Secretary of War Hegseth visits Puerto Rico amid military buildup targeting Venezuela. I wrote this one for the Institute on September 8th. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth and senior Pentagon officials made an unannounced visit to Puerto Rico on Monday. The Department of War has deployed a significant military force to the Caribbean as it plans for more strikes against alleged Venezuelan cartels. So the governor of Puerto Rico, Jennifer Gonzalez, praised Hegseth for recognizing the American colony's military value. She wrote on X, "Honored to welcome the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, along with General Dan Crane, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to Puerto Rico. We thank President Donald Trump and his administration for recognizing the strategic value Puerto Rico has to the national security of the United States and the fight against drug cartels in our hemisphere, perpetuated by narco dictator Nicolas Maduro." According to the Washington Post, the Department of War is weighing using Puerto Rico as its central hub to wage war against Latin American cartels. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has been targeted by the Trump administration. The State Department has placed a $50 million bounty on the Venezuelan leader. Additionally, Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio has designated an alleged Venezuelan cartel on the list of terror organizations and claims Maduro is the head of the criminal network. Trump has given the Department of War approval to take action against designated narco-terrorist organizations. Last week, the U.S. killed 11 people in a boat near Venezuela, claiming it was smuggling drugs. While Trump has said the regime change in Caracas is not the goal, a number of top U.S. officials said Washington wants to remove Maduro from power. The U.S. has deployed thousands of Marines, 10 F-35s, 3 guided missile destroyers, and an attack submarine to the Caribbean for these operations. So expecting new escalations in the conflict with Venezuela in days to come. This next article I have here is from the Libertarian Institute. NATO warplanes shoot down Russian drones over Poland. I wrote this one on September 10th. Russian drones crossed into Polish airspace and were downed by NATO fighter jets. A European official claimed the incursion in Polish airspace was an intentional provocation by Moscow. On Wednesday, 19 Russian drones and missiles crossed into Polish airspace from Ukraine. The Russian Defense Ministry said the drones were targeting military-industrial targets in western Ukraine. Russian ally Belarus claimed the drones flew off course due to electronic warfare. And this is something that has happened with Romania as well, where because of the direction the Russian attacks were coming from and how close the targets are to the border, when the drones are either hit by interceptors but not down, knocked off course, or there is some kind of electronic warfare jamming that prevents, these drones from knowing exactly where they are, they do tend to cross into other countries' airspace. Again, this has happened at least dozens, maybe even hundreds of times in Romania. And I think this is probably the most significant incursion into Poland. I've heard some claims that Russia is essentially trying to use the very close border region between like Ukraine and Poland to kind of sneak around some of Ukrainian air defenses, and that's the reason why this happened. It actually wasn't these planes veering off course, drones veering off course. I tend to think the electronic warfare is the more likely cause of this, but there are other theories, which we'll get into in a minute. So some of the drones were shot down, with debris landing on car and homes. Warsaw did not report any casualties. Prime Minister Donald Tusk called the Russian drones an unprecedented scale in violation of airspace and invoked Article 4 of the NATO Charter. Article 4 of the NATO Charter isn't Article 5. Article 5 is a mutual defense pact. Article 4 says that the alliance, any member of the alliance could essentially hold a meeting where everybody discusses the potential threat to their territorial integrity and sovereignty during that meeting. So I'm guessing that in sometime over the next weeks or months, Brussels will hold a meeting. All the NATO foreign ministers will probably get together, discuss this, and who knows, how they move on from there. The recovered wreckage of the drones suggests they were decoy models and not explosive UAVs. And so this is important. Now, some people are saying that this may be evidence that this was an intentional provocation by Russia. The fact that none of these drones were armed is at least interesting. One of the other kind of things is that the decoy drones are probably made cheaper, not just not carrying the explosives, but also they probably have less advanced components and equipment in them and make them easier to jam than the actual drones that are carrying the explosives and made with higher quality material. So the European Union's top foreign policy official asserted that Russia intended for the drones to enter Polish airspace to provoke NATO. Russia's war is escalating, not ending. What Russian President Vladimir Putin wants to do is to test us. What happened in Poland is a game changer. She went on to demand new sanctions on Russia, which is in no way a game changer. The West is constantly adding new sanctions on Russia, and they have little effect. President Donald Trump suggested the incursion could result in escalation of the conflict between NATO and the West. He said, "What's with Russia violating Poland's airspace with drones? Here we go!" Exclamation point. He wrote that on Truth Social. So an interesting take from Trump on this. It doesn't necessarily sound threatening, but it certainly sounds like he is prepared for this to escalate the conflict. Next up here, Trump will match any European tariffs on China and India. Wrote this one for JudgeNap.com on September 9th. President Donald Trump told the European Union that he would place matching tariffs on China and India. The economic penalties on the Asian superpowers are punishment for buying Russian oil. According to sources speaking with AFP, Trump said he would support a 50 to 100% tariff on Chinese and Indian imports during a call with European Union officials on Tuesday. The president has already placed a 50% tariff on India over Delhi's ties with Moscow. After taking office, Trump provoked a trade war with China, claiming that Beijing engages in unfair business practices. The trade war resulted in Washington and Beijing increasing tariffs to over 100%. In May, Chinese and American officials agreed to a trade truce and significantly reduced the tariff rate. Although, see, this is a good example of Trump's foreign policy not being American first. And so what he's doing is he's actually putting this in the hands of the Europeans, and he's saying, if you want to punish India and China, we'll go along with it. Now, maybe this is slightly better than him just doing it unilaterally, but the U.S. has this trade truce with China. And so let's say Europe does decide tomorrow 80% tariffs on all Chinese goods. Well, then Trump is locked into breaking his truce, his tariff truce with China. And so then this is going to create a massive problem between Washington and Beijing again, hurt the U.S. economy like it did when Trump initially started this trade war. And so this is really problematic. India, again, very problematic, pushing Delhi into the arms of Beijing. So after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the U.S. and its allies have taken several actions aimed at crippling the Russian economy. However, Russia has been able to weather the economic war by developing stronger ties with the global south, notably Beijing and Delhi. Trump is pressuring the EU to impose tariffs on India and China following multiple posts on Truth Social complaining about China's growing ties. Last week, the president wrote that India and Russia have been lost to China. Additionally, he claimed that a meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin, Chinese President Xi Jinping, and North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un was a conspiracy against the United States. Last up here, this article from our friend Dave DeCamp over at antiwar.com, written on September 7th, report, U.S. War Department to deprioritize China, focus on homeland and Western Hemisphere. So a newly rebranded Department of War is expected to release a national defense strategy that prioritizes missions in the homeland and in the Western Hemisphere over countering Russia and China, a shift from the Pentagon's policy in recent years, which has placed China as the top priority, according to a report from Politico. Now, the problem with this, because some people might say this sounds more America first, and I think to some respect it does. Certainly any responsible nation will be more concerned about securing its own borders than securing the Ukrainian or helping to expand the Israeli border or any of the other messes that we get in the Eurasian landmass and in Africa. It's certainly more America first to focus on things closer to America. I think the problem with this, we have seen this over the past 30 years, that when the U.S. government says we're shifting the mission, they're really just saying we're adding a new mission. It's not that they're going to focus less on Russia and China. It's not that they're going to end the proxy war in Ukraine, that they're going to stop the military or reverse the military buildup in the Indo-Pacific. We're not going to stop sending Israeli weapons. We're not going to stop bombing Somalia. We're not going to stop threatening Iran, right? We're not shifting away from the Eurasian landmass. We're just adding a new mission, and that's regime change in our own hemisphere, which is really, really dangerous and stupid. I mean, talk about moving towards a war that's going to start a real crisis in the United States. Very, very concerning. All right, so next up here, this article I wrote on September 8th at judgenap.com. Trump tells Hamas it must release hostages without Israeli agreement to end war. So President Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that Hamas must accept his latest proposal for the release of hostages. The president said that the post was the final warning to Hamas to accept the deal. Trump wrote, "Everyone wants the hostages home. Everyone wants this war to end. The Israelis have accepted my terms. It is time for Hamas to accept as well. I have warned Hamas about the consequences of not accepting. This will be my last warning. There will not be another one." According to Dropside News, the proposal includes Hamas returning the remaining living Israeli hostages and those deceased Israelis within 48 hours. After Hamas returns the hostages, Israel will release Palestinian prisoners, and a 60-day ceasefire will come into effect. The deal does not include an agreement with Tel Aviv to permanently end the conflict with the return of the Israeli hostages. Additionally, Hamas will likely reject any agreement that requires the captives to be released at the start of the ceasefire, as Israel has broken the previous truces. And so, from Hamas's perspective, releasing the hostages 3 a week, 5 a week, something like that, it creates a situation where Israel kind of has to keep the ceasefire going or the hostages stop coming out. And so this ensures that the ceasefire goes on, and that when Israel does things like stop allowing the aid into Gaza, even though that's a part of the ceasefire deal, Hamas has some leverage to get that restarted. That, I think, is what Israel wants to prevent, right? They want Hamas to lose all their leverage so they could just go in, destroy everything, and expel the Palestinians. A Hamas source told Dropsite News it looks like it was written by the Israelis, talking about Trump's proposal. So that's kind of funny, but also it does seem to be true that this proposal is essentially everything that Israel wants. Now, big news here. Hamas negotiators survive Israeli assassination strikes in Qatar. So the reason I discussed that story first is because that came out. Then Hamas leadership meets in Qatar to discuss Trump's proposal, and then Netanyahu orders an assassination. So on Tuesday, Israel targeted a house in Qatar where Hamas officials and its negotiating team were gathering. Hamas said the strikes killed 5 of its members but failed to take out the negotiators and leadership. Doha said one of its security officials were also killed. The strikes targeted a building housing members of Hamas's political bureau. Qatar has attempted to mediate a hostage exchange and ceasefire in Gaza. The attack involved at least 10 Israeli warplanes firing at least 10 missiles. Netanyahu claimed that the assassination attempt without assistance. Israel made the assassination attempt without assistance. Today's actions against the top terrorist chieftains of Hamas was a wholly independent Israeli operation. Israeli initiated it, Israeli conducted it, and Israel takes full responsibilities. The strikes followed President Donald Trump giving Hamas a proposal to end the conflict. Israel has repeatedly killed Hamas negotiators as talks to end the conflict were underway. The Hamas officials are meeting to discuss Trump's proposal. Hamas says it holds the U.S. and Israel jointly responsible for the strike. Additionally, Netanyahu started the war against Iran the day before the U.S. and Iranian officials were scheduled to meet on establishing a new nuclear agreement. A U.S. official told Axios that Tel Aviv did not inform Washington of the attack until the missiles were in the air, leaving the White House unable to weigh in on the strikes. However, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said Trump instructed his envoy Steve Witkoff to inform Doha of a pending attack, suggesting Washington had advance notice. And so again, if the missiles are in the air when the U.S. finds out, then it's kind of too late to tell the Qataris. So if you told the Qataris beforehand, that seems to be an indication that you knew beforehand. Additionally, this attack apparently occurred after the Israeli planes flew over Saudi and Qatari airspace. And so with the significant U.S. military capabilities in the Middle East, it seems highly, highly unlikely that 10 Israeli warplanes could fully load up, start moving not towards Gaza, not towards Syria, not towards Lebanon, not towards Yemen, but to the east, to Qatar or Iran, and that the U.S. somehow wouldn't know about this until the missiles were emerged. It just isn't, in any reasonable sense of the word, a believable or a likely story. Qatar, of course, condemned the attack, but honestly, the Qataris don't seem that upset about all this to me. Next up here, Qatari Prime Minister says Doha will continue its role as mediator and calls for a regional response to the Israeli attack. So I think this is important that, Qatar isn't just saying that we're done with the Israelis, we're not talking to the Israelis anymore. For the most part, it seems like some rhetoric condemning it, claiming it's a violation of sovereignty, international law, calling it terrorism. Really, it's all just rhetoric. Qatar is going to move forward with the same policy they had before the strike. And then this last article I wrote here for the Libertarian Institute on September 10th. Netanyahu threatens additional assassination attempts of Hamas officials in Qatar. After a failed attempt to assassinate the leadership of Hamas's political bureau in Qatar, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu threatened more attacks if Dawa did not arrest the Palestinian officials. On Wednesday, Netanyahu told Qatar to expel Hamas or bring them to justice because if you don't, we will. Israeli ambassador to the U.S. doubled down on Netanyahu's threat, telling Fox News, "If we didn't get them this time, we'll get them next time." The remarks followed an Israeli attack involving several munitions on a Hamas building in Qatar on Tuesday. While the strikes did not kill members of Hamas's leadership and negotiating team, 5 members of the organization were killed alongside a Qatari security official. The Hamas officials were meeting in Qatar to discuss a hostage exchange and ceasefire proposal that was presented by Donald Trump. The Wall Street Journal reports the assassination attempt caused a heated phone call between Trump and Netanyahu. Axios spoke with an official who said top members of the Trump administration were infuriated at Tel Aviv for failing to notify Washington the strike with enough time to weigh in. It's not necessarily that they opposed the attack, it seems like, merely that they weren't given enough notice. However, there is no indication that Trump plans to withdraw any of the substantial support that the U.S. provides to Israel. So again, some rhetoric here, some stories coming out, but no change in policy. All right, the next article I have is one written on September 8th for JudgeNaps.com. 14 Palestinian aid seekers killed, Sid starved to death as Israel continues the war on food. So once a week or so, I like to do an article where I kind of just update the numbers that we're getting out of Gaza. So on Monday, the Gaza Health Ministry reported that 14 aid seekers were killed. Since late May, over 2,400 Palestinians attempting to get aid have been killed. Additionally, 6 Palestinians, including 2 children, were starved to death. And now the number, I think I read this morning, 411 people, including 142 children, have now starved to death in Gaza since the start of the Israeli siege. And this was in addition to I think another 50 Palestinians died in Gaza on Monday, and that's been about the numbers reported over the past week. So since October 7, 2023, the Gaza Health Ministry has recorded 64,522 deaths from the war, over 160,000 injuries to go along with that. Those numbers are considered an undercount of the total number of Palestinians killed by Israel over the past 23 months, and this is in large part due to the fact that the health ministry is counting the bodies that show up at morgues and hospitals, not the tens of thousands of people under the rubble, not many of the Palestinians who are killed while walking around Gaza by Israeli snipers. Their bodies left to decompose and be picked apart by wild animals, maybe one day to be buried in a shallow grave by an Israeli bulldozer. Again, they will never be counted. Next up here, another article from JudgeNap.com. Ship attempting to break Israeli blockade of Gaza hit by drone. So the Global Smooth Flotilla, this is a group which I think there's going to be about 50 ships in total. Certainly dozens of them will be a part of this flotilla. They have a lot of high-profile names on board. I think the biggest of which is Greta Thunberg, the young climate change activist who has really just been working on the Gaza issue, as far as I could tell, over the past several months. So what they're doing is they're doing a few stops along the way. I'm sure they're raising some money. Other ships are joining the flotilla. Right now, I think there's about 20 ships in the group. And so they were doing some events in Tunis, I believe. The ships were anchored in Tunisian waters, and one of the flagships, one of the kind of lead ships of this flotilla was hit by an exploding drone. Now, I've kind of heard multiple stories. One was this was an explosive kamikaze drone. The second, this was a drone that was hovering above the ship and then dropped an explosive device on it. Since people were aboard the ship at the time, nobody was injured. It does look like there was significant damage done to the ship. While it's not exactly clear that Israel did carry out this attack, they have intercepted 2 flotilla ships previously trying to break the Israeli blockade of Gaza. Those ships were carrying food to the starving people of Gaza and were particularly attempting to bring formula into Gaza to help the starving infants and babies of the strip. So, that ship was seized. A second ship was seized, and then actually there was another ship. This one was in international waters, but near Malta. I believe this was last year, and this ship was hit by a drone. Again, in that case, it's not clear that Israel carried out the attack. However, there is some supporting evidence that Israel was behind it, including the appearance of an Israeli warplane in the region before the drone strike occurred. My guess is this was again Israel, and yesterday a second ship in the flotilla was hit in a similar attack. So my guess is we're going to see this continue to happen over the coming days. Netanyahu orders Palestinians out of Gaza City. Leave now. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu issued a threatening evacuation order to the Palestinians sheltering in Gaza City before Israel began its assault on the city last month. An estimated 1 million Palestinians were in the city. I say this to the residents of Gaza. I take this opportunity and listen to me carefully. You have been warned. Leave now. Netanyahu said Monday. He explained that the IDF was sent to begin ground maneuvers near Gaza City. Last month, Israel began a heavy bombing campaign in Gaza City. Netanyahu has ordered the IDF to expel the Palestinians and occupy the city. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz added to Netanyahu's threat, saying Tel Aviv was preparing to ramp up strikes on the ship, comparing the coming strikes to a mighty hurricane. In recent days, Israel has destroyed multiple high-rise buildings in Gaza City. On Monday, the Al Roa Tower was leveled. The building housed the Palestinian Red Crescent headquarters in Gaza. The PRCS condemned the bombing as another war crime committed against the Palestinian people and their institutions. On Sunday, President Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that he had sent a proposal to Israel and Hamas for a ceasefire. Trump demanded that the Palestinian military group accept the deal, but Hamas rejected the offer, saying it was unwilling to release all the hostages at the start of the ceasefire, and releasing the captives required a permanent end to the fighting. Destroying Gaza City appears to be the next step in Israel's plan to destroy the Strip and expel the Palestinians. This is interesting. This is an article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on September 8th. Israeli Supreme Court orders that detained Palestinians must be fed. The Israeli Supreme Court that Israel must feed detained Palestinians 3 meals a day. National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir has bragged about deliberately creating harsh conditions for Palestinians locked in Israeli prisons. The 3-judge panel ruled on Sunday that prisoners are fed 3 meals a day to ensure a basic level of existence. The court was split 2-1. The issue was brought by Israeli human rights group, who said a system of deprivation had been installed in Israeli prisons. The ruling said, "We are not speaking here of comfortable living or luxury, but basic conditions of survival required by law. Let us not share in the ways of our worst enemies." Since October 7, 2023, scores of Palestinians have died in Israeli captivity. Numerous international organizations, Western media, and Israeli news outlets have documented Israel's torture, beatings, medical neglect, and rape of Palestinian captives. According to data obtained by 972 magazine, that's an Israeli outlet, only 1 in 4 Palestinians detained by Israel are members of Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Ben-Gvir, who runs Israel's prisons, has bragged about the brutal conditions for Palestinians in detention. In a post in July of 2024 on X, he wrote, One of the top goals I set for myself was to worsen the conditions of terrorists in prisons and reduce their privileges to a minimum required by law. I waged an all-out war to implement the long-awaited reform to their conditions and to fulfill the mandate I received from the public. The terrorist conditions in prison were reduced to the minimum. We stopped financial deposits, canceled the canteens for terrorists, removed electrical appliances from cells, ended the terrorist pomade, drastically reduced their time in the showers, abolished the spokesperson status, stopped the indulgent food menu, and replaced it with a minimal one. Ben-Gvir vowed to defy the Supreme Court's orders, writing on X, Justices of the Supreme Court, are you Israelis? We will continue to provide the imprisoned terrorists in jail cells with the minimum conditions required by law. So that's just goes to show the mindset of the Israelis and how they treat the Palestinian detainees, many of them who are innocent civilians. Jared Kushner joins top U.S. and Israeli officials in Gaza meeting. So the top confidants of President Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met to discuss a proposal to end the conflict in Gaza that would require Hamas to release all the Israeli hostages at the start of the ceasefire. So this story broke shortly after Israel attempted the assassination in Qatar. And so I don't think it's really worth discussing the details of that ceasefire proposal because, of course, it's not going to happen because Israel is trying to assassinate the mediation team on the other side. Why I think this is important is because of who was at this meeting. It's Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, and Israeli Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer. I would guess that these are probably the three most influential people when it comes to Trump's Israel policy and also Netanyahu's Israel policy. That whatever is happening in Gaza, these three men have the most, if not all, the sway on the issue. And so that they are meeting and discussing this, I think is problematic because particularly Dermer and Kushner are hardened Zionists. These people are absolute lunatics who have been looking to expel all the Palestinians from the Strip. All right. Talking about the West Bank here real quick. Huckabee says the U.S. won't tell Israel not to annex the occupied West Bank. And so this is the second green light that we have seen from the Trump administration for Israel to annex the West Bank, a move that could be coming rapidly as the UN may vote in the coming days to make Palestine a UN member state, and Israel looks to make sure that doesn't happen. An update on Iran. Iran and the IAEA signed an agreement aimed at resuming nuclear inspections, and so Iranian officials met with the leadership of the International Atomic Energy Agency, that's the IAEA, in Egypt. The two sides came to an agreement, although it sounds more like a preliminary agreement than an actual one. The agreement doesn't say that the IAEA inspections of Iran are going to resume anytime soon, just that the two sides agreed to work towards that outcome. The IAEA inspectors were in Iran up until June when Israel and the United States launched an unprovoked war against Iran and its nuclear program. And Iran has asserted that at least some of the intelligence that Israel used in that war came from the IAEA. Last up here, this one from Day to Camp, September 10th, antiwar.com. Israel kills at least 35 in heavy airstrikes on Yemen. So heavy Israeli airstrikes targeted Yemen on Wednesday, hitting the capital of Sana'a and the Jawaf province, killing at least 39 people and wounding 131 more, according to the Yemeni Health Ministry. The Health Ministry's spokesman said on post on X that 28 people were killed in strikes on Sana'a, and 7 were killed in Jaffa in a final toll, as civilian death teams, ambulance, and rescue workers are still searching for missing persons under the rubble and debris. That number is likely to increase. And so this follows, I believe, the Houthis having a somewhat successful drone attack, on an Israeli airport, not the Ben Gurion, not their main airport, a secondary airport. But I do expect Israel to ramp up attacks on Yemen in the coming week in response, if they're not too busy waging wars against about every other country in the region. All right, everybody, that's where I'm going to wrap it up for today. I know I didn't talk about the Charlie Kirk assassination, which is a huge deal, on the show today. I will be discussing that later today on the Kyle Anzalone Show, so be sure you head on over and subscribe. And then, of course, support the Expat Money Summit. And if you're going to get a VIP ticket, be sure to use the promo code KYLE, Kyle, when you check out at expatmoneysummit.com.